Okay, so Maggie, A Girl of the Streets was written by Stephen Crane in 1893 when he was just 22 years old. So I think it's pretty interesting that someone like Crane, he was really fascinated with war history, but he chose to write his very first book about, modern day prostitutes. That's pretty interesting to me. He kind of had a pretty deep admiration for prostitutes. He wrote the book, and then he even tried to aid a woman that was he believed was being wrongfully arrested for prostitution. He even went as far to testify in court on her behalf. He then later went on to become close with a woman that owned a brothel. So Crane had a very close relationship with this type of lifestyle, and he had a really close observation to be able to look into it and offer some more insight on it. So through his book, he shows the life of a girl that's not given many options, and it shows the choices and the steps that she takes that eventually lead to her life as a prostitute and ultimately her demise. So the first author I'll talk about is Cannon. He places a lot of emphasis on the setting that Crane chose. So it talks about Bowery. That's where the main story is set in. That's where Maggie was born. It's where she was raised. That's eventually where she was banished from. So this was a place known for its prostitution, crime, poverty, severe alcoholism. So just not a great place for a young lady to prosper in, especially someone like Maggie. She had no support at home. Both her parents alcoholic, abusive. Her brother takes on that same role into adulthood. So she was just constantly made to feel unsafe, unwelcome, inadequate wherever she was. So I think this is kind of Crane's way of saying that women at that time were not really given a choice, and they chose prostitution as a last resort. So the second point, Cannon, he describes a lot of fight for identity. So we start the story with Jimmy as a kid fighting the other kids, and then here's Maggie. She's in tattered clothes. She's hidden behind the dirt and filth, and she's kind of hidden behind caring for her younger sibling. Jimmy tries to just convince everyone he's this strong guy. He's always fighting people. Fighting anybody, really. And so they're just kind of always trying to convince someone of what they are. So, and a lot of it focuses on the stronghold that the poverty has on them, that they will just never truly be able to escape it, and they will always have these questions that will never be answered. The third point is Maggie was mesmerized by the woman on stage that she sees. She's a woman, she's dancing, and she'll be on stage dancing, and she leaves stage and comes back in less clothing each time. And Maggie's completely oblivious to what kind of show she's watching. She's just fascinated by all the silk and thinks about how much it cost. And Cannon describes it as, with each removal of cloth, it's like the dancer is removing more and more of her respectability and her dignity. And it also really alludes to how easy it is for women to fall into the life of a sex worker because they have nothing to sell but their body. Women at this time, the poor immigrant women. The fourth point talks about Maggie's primitivism that she tried really hard to escape from. She wanted to present herself as this person of wealth and carry herself as, higher class. She wanted to pretty much fake it till she make it, and, to get Pete to like her and everything. And she was just trying to pretend like she didn't come from Rum Alley, where she's from. And a lot of this, I think it foreshadows her eventual descent into prostitution, because as a prostitute, she's also pretending to be something she's not, pretending to be interested in her clients to make a living and everything. So it really indicates how Maggie's performativity will never end. She'll never stop pretending to be something she's not. The fifth point, the last point, is Cannon touches on the character's virtue. So you have Jimmy. He ran away from Hattie, a woman that we are to believe that he got pregnant, and he's avoiding her. And then Maggie comes home, needing help, and he turns her away. And he pretends like he's doing this because he's this virtuous person, that has this honor, but really he's deluded by his virtue. And all this shows his savage nature, how awful he treats women. And it's also kind of a little reference to the men at this time, because there were so many immigrants coming to the States. And so men at this time, white men at this time, they kind of just held themselves to a higher standard, kind of thought they were above the law. Okay, so the next author I'll talk about is Sidney Krause. So Krause says that Maggie, she fantasizes and romanticizes the realistic situations in life. So she kind of doesn't really see life for what it is. She kind of sees it through rose-colored lenses. She's really sweet, putting the flower in her brother's hand. Krause explains it as a queasy atmosphere, a disorientation. So it does really make her an easy target for people to exploit her and abuse her, pretty much like what Pete did to her. But I think Crane chose this characteristic for Maggie specifically because it shows that those choices that are made in desperation, like prostitution, are something that could be due to just lack of knowledge. Like, these young girls just don't know that there's any other choice, and they just go with what they know. Okay, the second point talks about how Crane uses the environment to show how it shapes the lives of the people that live there. So, like Maggie, she had a life that was absent of love and compassion. So when Pete gave her just a little bit of attention, she really jumped on that. And so it was really her infatuation with him that really domino affected her into the deeper, the pits of hell, because, he broke her heart. She had nowhere else to go. And so it really shows Crane's naturalism writing that, she's dealt this hard choice, and she does eventually make the final choice for herself of, she does become a prostitute, but she maintained what little dignity she had left. So the third point talks about the large, greasy man that was with Maggie in her final moments of life that we see her. He's described as an attendant priest, is how Krause describes him. And so I think describing him this way, it really references how this man provided some sort of relief for Maggie. Because if he was the one that ended Maggie's life, because we see her and then she dies, that if he was the one that ended her life, it's possible that he provided her a service, because he ended her suffering. And, like a priest would do, gave her that final consolation from her sins, and he freed her. So I think it's a really interesting choice of words. The next point talks about Maggie. She goes deeper and deeper into the darkness towards the river. And so the buildings start to have human characteristics like eyes and lips. And really describing the building's inanimate objects in this way really dehumanizes Maggie specifically. And it really shows like how the buildings are becoming even more human than she is, and shows how truly unhuman she was towards the end of her life. How she just wasn't herself, and all her humanity had been drained from her. I mean, even the buildings, they weren't noticing her. They just were looking over her. So it really strips her of that last little bit of dignity that she had. And the fifth point is Crane's surrealism style of writing. So that's pretty much how Crane will use situations that are kind of like almost comical, but it's something that's really happening where you're like, I cannot believe this is happening. And so Krause uses the example at the bar when, Maggie is left with Freddie. It's her and him and this complete stranger, and he's really drunk, talking and stuff. And, he pays her fare for the cab, and as she's watching him, in the rearview mirror, he falls off the steps. And it's just funny that it happens. Krause explains it as mockeries of life, because you just can't believe it's happening. But I think it really shows that's kind of an introduction of Maggie's introduction into adulthood, because she sees how hard life can be and how unconventional and complex it can be. You never know what's going to happen, but she this happens and she still stays out. She still has a good time. She doesn't just go home and cry. And I think that really says a lot about Maggie. So the last author is, I don't think I said her name right. I'm going to say Tank. So the first point, Tank, she focuses really heavily on Mary Johnson when she discovers that Maggie is dead. It talks a lot about her mouth. And so when she's told that Maggie has passed away, she is eating and she continues to eat, and then she finishes her meal, and then she grieves her daughter. And so there's a lot of focus on her throughout the whole story, how mean she is. She's drunk and she's abusive and she's just a really awful lady. But then in this moment, as she's eating and grieving, it really humanizes her more and makes her more relatable, because she's a poor immigrant woman, so she can't afford to miss a meal because food is scarce in that neighborhood at that time, and so she can't even stop eating even to grieve something like her daughter. So going a little bit further into that, Tank talks about how Crane uses small spaces to allow for a different experience. So it makes it more intimate experiences where you are reading more than with all your other senses instead of just with your sight. So there's a lot of imagery of like food and like what they're eating, what they're drinking, and that kind of stuff, and how they're deep emotions. And so it really focuses on a different kind of hunger in the characters, not just for food, but for life or whatever. Maggie has a really deep desire to be loved. Pete wants to be respected. Jimmy wants power and, people to fear him pretty much. And so it goes a lot deeper than just a hunger for food. And so it is like, they'll always be hungry, always need to eat. They will always thirst and want these feelings that they have, but they'll never truly be fulfilled. And so Tank describes that as Crane's way of breaking down the barriers between reader and observer so that you can experience their lives more closely, more in a more intimate way. And so the next point talks about the dialect that Crane chooses. The way that the characters talk is a little difficult. It's a little difficult to read. But there is even a part in this passage that Crane was asked if he wanted to change it to make it where it was more suitable for all readers to enjoy it, but he didn't want to. He wanted to keep it exactly how it was, exactly how the people at that time talked and how they behaved, because he wanted it to be as accurate as possible in the depiction of these people. And so it really allows, for the reader, this may not be something that you would typically experience, of course, like something we wouldn't experience because this happened so long ago, but it really breaks down lines between like racial, ethnicity, class hierarchies. It lets that line be crossed so you can experience it in a different way. The fourth point, so Crane does perpetuate some negative stereotypes in the story, like potatoes are typically an Irish dish, and that's a lot of what they eat. And, a lot of times the Irish you'll see have a drinking problem, and it's something they're proud of. So that's a lot of what you see, and it could be inferred as a little insulting, but it could I think it's more just emphasizing how rough life was in Rum Alley, how hard these people had it, and how hard life was for them where they come from. And honestly, it's kind of amazing showing these families and how dysfunctional they can be, but then how well they function, in keeping a home and all this. It's pretty cool. So, and the last point I'll make, the fifth point, Crane draws a lot of heavy attention to certain parts of the body, like the mouth, the teeth, the throat, all that. And so it kind of is emphasizing the voice for the poor, because we're talking about the poor, we're in the lives of the poor. And so this is the voice because the mouth is where a story starts, where it ends. And then it also kind of shows like the character, like what kind of behavior they have, maybe what their intentions are, like showing their teeth can be kind of a sign of trying to scare someone, and then not showing your teeth, just talking normal is a little bit more inviting. Okay, that's it.